Concerns are growing over ASEAN unity as it marks its 50th anniversary, as ASEAN's ambition to move beyond an initial mandate of confidence building towards preventative diplomacy and conflict resolution gain any momentum. China's low-profile diplomacy has been replaced by a more visible role on the world stage, as the Belt and Road Initiative recognizes Asia's economic geography. Will China stand as guardian of globalization in the region? While the Trump administration does not yet have clear policy lines on Asia, will the Shangri-La Dialogue provide a platform for Washington to reaffirm America's strategic commitment to its Asian allies?
Our various trade representatives and negotiators did their best to make sure that they could bring back something which the political leaders could stand by and support.
As the security structure evolves, geographical tensions, including the South China Sea, will remain major tests for the future. What are the solutions for the security challenges of a multipolar Asia-Pacific? CGTN anchor Yang Rui is joined by four distinguished panelists in today's discussion. Kishore Mahbubani at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Major General Yao Yun at the Academy of Military Science, People's Liberation Army of China. Professor Huang Jing on U.S.-China relations at Lee Foundation, and Alexander Neal at International Institute for Strategic Studies.
With the South China Sea disputes, THAAD deployment, the Taiwan and DPRK nuclear tension, the peace and stability of the Asia-Pacific region has faced many challenges in the past year as China's Belt and Road Initiative gains momentum, and with the whims of the Trump administration's Asia-Pacific disengagement, lots of issues need to be discussed during this year's Shangri-La Security Dialogue. Welcome to the special edition of Dialogue in Singapore. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion here. Now, China and ASEAN have recently agreed upon a code of conduct framework. What do you think of the execution? Do you think it's easy to get the job done?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a big step forward to get this code of conduct done, because as you know, the South China Sea issue has been a difficult one in recent times in China-ASEAN relations. But the waters, which were stormy 2 years ago, have calmed quite a bit. And I think if they continue to make progress on the code of conduct, and if they continue to have negotiations and dialogue, I think then we will see a relatively calm situation on the South China Sea.
A warship has recently sailed within the 12 nautical miles of a Chinese island or reef, whatever you call it. And therefore, do you think this is a clear indication of the Trump administration that pressure is being inflicted upon China to urge remarkable progress on the issue of denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula? Or do you think President Trump is yielding to domestic pressure to look tough and talk tough to China over the South China Sea? Yuanzhu?
I think these two things should be separated. For China, China has both national interest both in the South China Sea and in the Korean Peninsula, and China would decide its policy based on its own national interest, based on its own sense of international responsibilities, but not to change, to bargain, to have this kind of deal-making approach with President Trump. So if you ask whether President Trump had done the freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea as a signal or something, personally I think it's just a continuation of this kind of operations for decades. It started in 1979, it has been going on all the time, and the last such operation was done in last year, in October last year. So this is the first time that this.
Do you think this freedom of navigation operation has undermined the remarkable progress that China and ASEAN have achieved about the code of conduct?
Frankly, I don't think so. I think that we should not over-explain the operation of the United States in South China Sea, because yes, President Donald Trump has abolished TPP or rebalance, so on and so forth. But United States of America never gave up the freedom of navigation, because United States has a fundamental stake in peace and stability in the region, which of course a common interest of China and other countries. So that the over-explanation of the naval operation in South China Sea is not necessary and not helpful. I think that no matter what happened, and the United States will stay here, and naval operation will carry on. But whether it enters the 12 nautical miles of China's claimed islands or other country islands, I think that depends on the context. In this regard, I think this one should not be seen as provocative as the previous ones. And
Alex, what do you think of the remarkable progress in the COC negotiations and the freedom of navigation operation by the US Navy?
Well, I think it's a good sign. It's a sign of progress. There have been some questions raised, though, about the legality of it, whether it's legally binding or not. And of course, it's also behind closed doors. So the various parties in this agreement haven't really revealed much in public about this, but it's definitely a step forward towards confidence building in the region. But I agree with my friends here that one shouldn't really conflate the US freedom of navigation operations. That's a policy that's quite consistent with the US Navy, with consensus building within ASEAN.
I think it's not an issue between China and the United States. It is an issue between China and almost all the other South China Sea claimants, because all the other claimants have requested by their national law for pre-permission or pre-consent if warships, military ships were to enter into, were to transit into territorial waters, or even doing some military exercise in the EEZ. So it's not only China who is at odds with the United States. Other countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, Malaysia, they are all at odds with the United States on this issue.
I think the issue here is freedom of navigation for what kind of ship. If for commercial ships, I think it's easy. But now it's a warship. That's the definition of freedom of navigation. That is that.
The issue is who is militarizing South China Sea, Kishore?
Well, I mean, I think it's useful sometimes when you look at issues like this to step back and look at the big picture. Okay? And one paradox about the United States pushing for freedom of navigation, right, is that paradoxically, China is a much bigger exporter than the United States is. There are more goods traveling to and fro China than there are goods traveling to and fro America. So when the United States pushes for freedom of navigation, it is actually helping China's larger interest to make sure that goods continue to sail between China and the rest of the world. So in the larger context, there's actually a convergence of interests between China and the United States. But on the narrow area of South China Sea, there it gets a bit more complicated. But even in that area, it's actually wise, and I've actually written about this in one of my books. The United States should think about the world 20 or 30 years from now. In a world 20 or 30 years from now, China's economy will be larger than America's. China's navy may well be larger than America's. Chinese naval vessels will be patrolling 12 miles off California regularly. So I ask my friends in America, do you want to see that happen? Or do you want to create a new order where you avoid this kind of aggressive naval patrolling? Because if you are doing this aggressive naval patrolling of Somalia, I say, yes, you have to do it because you're blocking off threats to navigation. There are no threats to navigation in the South China Sea. I mean, every day, hundreds, if not thousands of ships are going through South China Sea with no problem.
Here is a problem with what you say, Alex. I'm afraid what Kishore says suggests clearly that China is ready and is likely to challenge the maritime primacy of the U.S. Navy, the blue water Navy of the United States.
I say 20 or 30 years.
20 years from now. Do you think that's likely to happen?
Back to your question about militarization, I think there's no doubt that we've seen 3 large naval and air bases appear in the middle of the Spratly Islands. over the last 3 years. The United States Navy has historically been transiting the South China Sea since the 1800s, when the Perry expedition first went to Japan. During the Vietnam War, the United States Navy was there. And this year, carrier strike groups have been transiting the South China Sea. What the US wants to pursue is this idea of freedom of the seas, which is a shared principle with China. And you're right to say that sea lanes of communication have not been challenged. I think the big question we need to face, and which is the strategic question which Kishore is mentioning, is the question of accommodation of the resident power in the South China Sea and elsewhere, the United States, and China as a new strategic arrival in the region.
Perhaps waters in or around the 9-dash line in the South China Sea has been pretty quiet. If you look at the turning point in Manila's foreign policy, particularly China policy, after President Duterte assumed office, and when you look at the high-profile Vietnam delegation that came to Beijing to negotiate about bilateral trade early this year. Now, in fact, all claimants, as General Yun Zhu said correctly, seek to have a diplomatic solution to this. At this moment, perhaps this freedom of navigation operation may have stolen the spotlight of the Korean Peninsula, the divided Korean Peninsula. The nuclear test, the missile test by the DPRK may have been the prioritized issue on the agenda of President Trump. And James Mattis said, let's leave aside brush aside the South China Sea. Let's look at the denuclearization. What do you think of this argument?
Well, I think first and foremost, you're right, a diplomatic solution in the South China Sea is absolutely paramount. Secondly, I believe that the only chance of confrontation in the South China Sea is going to be a military escalation. The protection of sea lanes of communication is all a common interest for the region. There's been a hiatus of 6 months since the last freedom of navigation operation, probably more. And the Trump administration has been, quite rightly, I imagine, assessing its own position, because all of this escalation occurred during the Obama administration. But I fundamentally, rivalry and tension on the Korean Peninsula is the #1 common interest of the United States and China and all of the other regional parties. And it's clear from the Mar-a-Lago summit that North Korea was an area of common ground where Xi Jinping and Donald Trump could work together.
Well, can I just completely agree with what Alex said? And I think you're absolutely right when you said that there's a convergence of interests of United States and China on the Korean Peninsula to prevent the nuclearization of the Korean
After
Peninsula.
the U.S. delivered a mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, we're going to converge more in the Korean Peninsula?
Yes. I mean, frankly, if North Korea actually really develops, let's say, an intercontinental nuclear capability, whatever you might call it, then I think it's bad for United States, but also bad for China. And remember that, frankly, in the short run, China may have more to lose, because a nuclearized North Korea can trigger a nuclearized Japan, maybe a nuclearized South Korea, and that's what they call opening the Pandora's box. And therefore, there's actually a very strong convergence of interest between the United States and China or North Korea. But to build on that convergence of interest, you've got to look at the entire chessboard, the global chessboard, and ensure that if you're going to collaborate and develop working on the North Korean issue, you've got to make sure you don't start up issues, let's say, that in the South China Sea, that then interfere with your trust to deal with North Korea. So the relationship between United States and China should always be seen in a larger, comprehensive fashion, where both sides should see where their larger common interests are and where their larger divergent interests are, and then try to balance them.
Kishore, a majority of the Chinese agree with you that the nuclear ambition of the DPRK might be a threat to China, but for a different reason. Because the United States has agreed to provide your allies, its allies in the Northeast Asia with the nuclear umbrella since the end of the Second World War. Whilst the nuclear fallout of the nuclear reactors of the DPRK might be a very menacing, scary threat to security of people in northeastern China. You're watching Dialogue with Kishore, Yun Zhu, Jing, and Alex. We're talking about whether we're going to have more war clouds over South China Sea or the divided Korean Peninsula after President Trump assumed the presidency. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. So much for the story about the USS Dewey passing within 12 nautical miles of Meiji Reef in the South China Sea. Let's look at why it's reported that the U.S. is likely to deploy a third aircraft carrier into the West Pacific Ocean soon. Is the U.S. flexing muscle in the Asia-Pacific region a safeguard or a threat to the regional stability, Alex?
The United States, as we've already discussed, is a regional hegemon militarily. The convergence of interests on the Korean Peninsula between China and the US is something that really needs to be built upon. But currently, because of elevated tensions on the peninsula, the United States feels that it must show some degree of military capability in the region. So the deployment of an additional carrier to the region, some may argue, increases tension. But saber rattling in the region is something that has been going on for ever since the end of the Cold War. I think what's really important is that the North understands that continued proliferation activity is unacceptable under UN Security Council resolutions, and that's a common agreement, a global consensus.
Yeah, but the issue here is that do we really need 3 battle groups in the region? And North Korea is not really a kind of military power that deserves 3 battle groups. And the first. And second issue is that the third one, the additional one coming here, will be here forever or just for this reason. I think that there is some issues, some concerns for countries like China, and because 3 battle groups in the region, obviously, is more than enough than North Korea.
Kishore?
Yeah, I must say I agree with Huang Jing, because I can understand the pressure on the American leaders to show that they're doing something. But let's be very clear on one thing. War is not an option in the Korean Peninsula. Almost on day one, I don't know, 1 million citizens of Seoul may die. Okay, so let's be very clear about that. So when an American leader says the time for strategic patience is over, when they imply that a military solution is possible, there's no military solution possible. And so that's why actually I do believe that if the years of sanctions and threats have not worked with North Korea, why not try the exact opposite and try dialogue, engagement, and make assurances to North Korea? For example, a very simple security assurance that the United States could give is that in the event that North and South Korea reunify, if it ever happens, United States will withdraw all its forces from the Korean Peninsula, so a reunified Korea therefore would not mean a US presence on China's border. That kind of security assurance, a long-term one, will change the chemistry of the Korean issue.
Yuan Zhu, can you clarify China's position on the Korean nuclear issue?
I think China is very clear that it seeks 3 goals on the Korean Peninsula. One is denuclearization, that's number 1. The second one is stability. And the third one is that the denuclearization should be achieved by peaceful political means, not by military means. And recently, the Chinese government had proposed a suspension for suspension suggestion, has made that proposal as a first step to reduce tension on the Korean Peninsula. The suspension for suspension is that for the DPRK, it should suspend all its military and missile activities, and for the United States and ROK, they should suspend their massive military exercise so that the good atmosphere and a positive interaction dynamics could be generated on the Korean Peninsula, so that all the relevant parties would be more willing or motivated to come to the negotiating table.
But the DPRK has been pretty angry with our response towards their nuclear ambitions because China has joined the United Nations Security Council for the economic sanctions, and the economic sanctions have proved to be more severe because China has cut its import of North Korean coal, as well as here is the haunting specter that China will further consider cutting our supply of oil to the DPRK, which might be a lifeline for the survival of this regime. Jing, do you think China has made concessions? And because we don't have to, because China does not want to have a trade war with President Trump, who threatened to use the One China principle or the DPRK as a bargaining chip to advance the American interests or prioritizing American interests in the bilateral trade.
No, I don't think so. I don't think the case is at all. I think China joined the United States and other countries to sanction against North Korea is to defend China's own interests.
Yes.
Because nuclear issue, nuclear weapon system in North Korea obviously substantially undermine China's own interests, including security interests.
In terms of what?
In terms
the
of
balance of terror?
Yeah, just Kishore and everybody said that it is a source of instability in the Korean Peninsula. It is also a source of nuclear proliferation. No matter what, it's against China's interests. We also remember that the 26 million people in North Korea, if war happened, we don't want to make another Iraq or another Afghanistan or another Syria in this region. So China has the ability and the capability to maintain peace and stability here. It is for that reason China thinks that nuclear issue, North Korean nuclear issue, is a source of problem. China wants North Korea to stop that. To put pressure on them is not to make them collapse. That's totally different. To make them understand that only by giving up the nuclear weapon system, that peace and stability can guaranteed. In that regard, China would love to work with other countries to bring North Koreans, Americans, South Koreans back to the negotiation table.
Well, many observers are a little bit disappointed that China will not be able to send a high-profile delegation to the Shangri-La Security Dialogue this time around. They are afraid that China may have missed a good opportunity to rebuild the mil-to-mil relationship between Washington and Beijing. Towards the end of this very enlightening discussion agenda, Kishore, are you confident and optimistic that Washington will first of all prioritize its economic ties with Beijing, and military concerns, security scenario will get improved a little bit as a result?
And I think if you are China and you're trying to read America and understand what its attitude towards you, you get so many confusing signals. So it's very difficult. You mentioned that China didn't take advantage of this opportunity to send a high-level delegation to the Shangri-La Dialogue. I actually agree that it'd be good for China to seize the opportunity to try and engage the United States, because the United States is a very confusing global player today. I mean, Alex spoke about providing assurances to South Korea and Japan. I completely agree with you that the United States should provide assurances to South Korea and Japan. But if the United States destroys the TPP on day one of the Trump presidency, that was a big shock to Japan.
To say nothing of the negative impact of rejecting the climate change deal. Alex,
Yeah,
what do you think of the mil-to-mil ties?
That's why I keep emphasizing that you have to look at the big picture and try and figure out what are American policies overall. You can't just figure one move here, one move there, and try and make sense of it.
Well, I mean, there's clearly been slash and burn going on within the global order. And of course, China is very concerned about not just strategic stability in the nuclear domain, but the general stability of the bilateral relationship. I think, if we just strip away all speculation, we know that Donald Trump is a businessman first and foremost. And the Belt and Road Initiative actually demonstrated that maybe there's some areas where the United States could work under the auspices of the Belt and Road Initiative. Donald Trump, he sent Matthew Pottinger, his national security advisor, to the Belt and Road Summit. I think that's a good sign.
I completely agree with him that in fact, I've written about this, a column saying that an infrastructure partnership between China and the United States is a marriage made in heaven. Because, I mean, the United States clearly needs to do something radical about improving its infrastructure. China is the new infrastructure superpower of the world, and if they work together, it will be fantastic. But of course, what's holding it back is politics. And that's what we need to address.
What should be done doesn't mean it will be done. I think right now the major problem indeed is that the United States is deeply divided But Donald Trump, as a president who take a ride of the division, he's not take the leadership to overcome the division. He make it worse. That's why we have a divided United States and even divided administration of Donald Trump. That's why he's inconsistent. I think that's major problem. South China Sea or North Korea or One Belt One Road, the number one problem is that we need a consistent and persistent leadership, which is absent right now.
All my friends have mentioned mainly is the consistency of policies. The policy team which has not been formed yet, and the unpredictability, uncertainty of the administration itself and the president himself. But still, currently, I'm optimistic about China-American relations. We have found some new areas to cooperate and some new ways to interact.
That's it.
Probably the U.S. government has returned to what President Xi Jinping calls for, new type of major power relationship, the essence of which is to seek no confrontation, no conflicts. Instead, we should usher in an era of mutual benefits, mutual respect, and co-prosperity. That is also the bulk of the Belt and Road Initiative. With that, we come to the end of this special program of dialogue on sidelines of the Shangri-La Security Dialogue in Singapore. Until next time, goodbye.